Welcome to Sleepy Dark Past, the place where forgotten secrets of ancient history come alive through slow, immersive storytelling. Let this gentle voice guide you back thousands of years, to an age when humanity's faith in the gods was not just whispered in prayers, but written in blood in the journey ahead. A 5-chapter exploration. We will uncover the strangest and most haunting rituals ever performed. From the blood-soaked temples of the Aztecs and the mysterious child sacrifices of Carthage, to the chilling ceremonies at the altars of Baal, where human lives were offered as sacred gifts. You'll meet the forgotten victims, learn about beliefs that defy modern logic, and confront truths that still unsettle the present world. This isn't just a history story. It's an expedition into the darkest corners of human faith and fear. So lie back, relax, close your eyes, and let these words guide you gently towards sleep. A sleep guarded by ancient spirits and prayers carved in blood. And before we begin our descent into the shadows, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single mysterious journey into the past here on Sleepy Dark Past. If you were unlucky enough to wake up in the heart of Tenochtitlan around the year 1487, the first thing you'd probably notice, after the blinding sun and the smell of roasted maize, is the screaming. And not the fun, festival kind of screaming. No, this was the kind that echoed off temple walls and bounced around the plazas like an ominous drumbeat. It was sacrifice day again, and for the Aztecs, that was just another Tuesday. Let's get one thing straight before we dive headfirst into the obsidian blade. The Aztecs didn't perform human sacrifices because they were bloodthirsty lunatics. They did it because they genuinely believed it was necessary to keep the universe from collapsing. The central concept here was something called tonali, a Nahuatl word meaning divine heat or life force. Without tonali, which they believed flowed through human blood, the sun god, Huitzilopochtli would grow weak, and the sun itself might fail to rise. So yes, every sunrise you've ever enjoyed could, in Aztec terms, have been powered by someone's still beating heart. Sleep tight. The Aztecs were nothing if not ambitious. They built towering temples called teocalli, literally god houses, and atop these steep pyramids, priests dressed in jaguar skins or feathered cloaks would conduct rituals that were part religion, part theater, and part horror film. The victim, often a captured warrior, sometimes a volunteer, yes, really, would be laid across a stone altar. Then, with a ceremonial blade made of obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass, sharper than steel and far deadlier, the priest would slice open the chest and offer the still beating heart to the gods. The blood would be painted onto idols, poured into sacred bowls, or even smeared on the lips of the statue of Huitzilopochtli himself. Because apparently, even sun gods need a post-battle snack, and the numbers? They were staggering. During the dedication of the great temple of Tenochtitlan in 1487, Spanish sources claimed that as many as 20,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Modern historians debate this number. Some say it was only 4,000 because, that's so much better. Regardless of the exact figure, the event was a display of divine devotion, political power, and good old-fashioned intimidation. Imagine being a neighboring tribe watching a river of blood flow down a pyramid. You'd probably think twice before refusing tribute, but sacrifice wasn't just about keeping the sun alive. It was also a cosmic recycling program. The Aztecs believed in cosmic debt, the idea that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humanity now owed them payment in return. This wasn't metaphorical. The entire empire was structured around this belief. Warfare, known as flower wars, Kosayoyetl, was often waged not to conquer territory, but to capture prisoners for the altars. In a strange twist of logic, a captured enemy's greatest honor wasn't to live. it was to die gloriously atop a temple, fueling the universe with their tonale. And yet, for all the gore and terror, there was a strange beauty to the Aztec worldview. It was deeply poetic, if a little insane. They saw life and death as two sides of the same sacred coin. Blood was not just blood. It was the essence of stars, the breath of gods, the fuel that kept creation spinning. To them, offering it wasn't cruelty. It was duty. And in a cosmic sense, it was love. Of course, the Spanish didn't quite see it that way. When Hernan Cortes and his conquistadors stumbled into Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were horrified and probably a little queasy. But they also recognized the power behind it. Sacrifice was more than religion. It was a tool of empire, a spectacle that bound people together in fear, awe, and faith. So the next time you complain about getting out of bed for work, remember this. Somewhere 5 centuries ago, an Aztec priest was climbing 100 stone steps, carrying a man whose heart would literally rise with the sun. And suddenly, your Monday morning doesn't seem so bad, does it? This is just the beginning of our blood-soaked journey. The Aztecs were not alone in their offerings to the gods, far from it. Across oceans and deserts, other civilizations would perfect their own dark rituals. And next, we travel to the shores of the Mediterranean, where one of history's most mysterious peoples offered their children to an ancient god of fire. If the Aztecs believed the sun needed blood to keep shining, the ancient Carthaginians believed something even more unsettling, that the gods preferred children. And not just any children, their children. Congratulations, humanity. We've reached a new level of what were they thinking. Welcome to Carthage, the mighty Phoenician city-state perched along the North African coast, near modern-day Tunis. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the Mediterranean. Their ships ruled the seas, their merchants built empires, and their generals terrified the Romans. But behind the bustling markets and grand harbors lay something far darker. A hidden ritual that would haunt their reputation for millennia. The heart of it all was a place the Carthaginians called the Tophet, not a fun theme park, but a sacred open-air sanctuary dedicated to their gods. Baal Hammon, the chief god of fertility and the sky, and Tennet, the mother goddess, symbol of life and moonlight. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of small urns buried here, each containing the charred remains of infants and young children. Some jars even hold the tiny bones of newborns. And no, these weren't just victims of disease. The evidence strongly suggests they were sacrificed, deliberately, ritually, and with disturbing regularity. Here's how it likely happened. When the Carthaginians sought divine favor, maybe before a war, during a famine, or after a plague, they would offer their most precious gift. A child, sometimes their own, sometimes purchased from a slave market, was placed into the hands of a towering bronze statue of Baal Hammon, often depicted as a seated figure with arms outstretched. Beneath those arms, a roaring fire burned. As the ceremony began, the statue's metal arms grew searing hot, and the child would slide from them into the flames below. Priests played drums and flutes to drown out the screams, because nothing kills the mood of a religious ritual quite like the sound of pure horror. And before you think, surely they didn't mean it literally. Oh, they did. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, including Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, described these rituals with barely concealed disgust. Diodorus wrote that the Carthaginians offered up their most beloved children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from the poor and sacrifice them as if they were their own. Plutarch added that the place resounded with the wailing of parents, even hardened Roman soldiers, men who thought crucifixion was a fun afternoon activity, were horrified by what they saw. Now, to be fair, and history is all about uncomfortable fairness. Modern scholars debate just how frequent or widespread these sacrifices really were. Some argue that many of the remains found in the Tophet might be from children who died naturally, and the cremation was a symbolic offering rather than a literal one. Others, however, point out that the sheer scale of the evidence, thousands of urns over centuries, is hard to explain without deliberate ritual killing. It's one of those historical mysteries where the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, some may have died naturally, but yes, some were absolutely sacrificed. But why would an advanced, wealthy civilization do something so nightmarish? The answer lies in the Carthaginian worldview, one that combined religion, fate, and cosmic reciprocity into a single terrifying equation. They believed the gods had immense power over their city's fate, harvests, weather, fertility, even military victory. And in a world where death and disaster lurked around every corner, the greatest offering was the greatest sacrifice, the life of an innocent. By giving up what they loved most, they believed they were ensuring the survival of the many god. It's a concept historians sometimes refer to as substitutional atonement, which, in this context, means offering something precious, often a life, to pay for a collective sin or to secure divine favor. It's a theological principle that pops up in many ancient religions, though most stop short of tossing toddlers into a furnace. Carthage's enemies, of course, weaponized this practice as propaganda. The Romans in particular loved portraying them as savage, godless monsters, the perfect excuse for annihilation. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, they famously salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. But even in destruction, the city's dark legacy lingered. The image of the child sacrifice became a symbol of ultimate barbarism, a kind of historical shorthand for humanity's capacity for cruelty in the name of faith. And yet, and this is the part that might keep you awake tonight, the Carthaginians didn't see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as devout. They believed that their gods demanded sacrifice, and they gave willingly, painfully, faithfully. It's easy for us, sitting comfortably centuries later, to scoff and say, how could they? But in their eyes, how could they not? If the survival of their city, their crops, their very existence depended on the favor of the divine, then no price was too high. As the flames of Baal Hammond's altar faded into history, they left behind more than ash. They left a question that echoes through time. How far would humanity go to please the gods? And if you think child sacrifice was the worst of it, oh, my friend, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because next, we journey to the ancient Near East, where the line between ritual and horror blurred even further, and where sacrifices weren't just about devotion. They were about contracts with forces far darker than any human could comprehend. If the Aztecs believed blood kept the sun alive, and the Carthaginians thought it could save their city, then the people of the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia to Canaan and beyond, took things a step further. For them, blood wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a legal document. Yes, you heard that right. In their worldview, spilling blood was the equivalent of signing a cosmic contract, except instead of ink, you used a knife, and instead of a signature, you offered a beating heart. Who needs lawyers when you've got lamb entrails and divine wrath? To understand this mindset, we need to start in the Fertile Crescent, often called the cradle of civilization. It's here, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq and parts of Syria, that some of humanity's oldest cities, like Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, flourished. These people were pioneers. They invented writing, built empires, and even created the first legal codes. But they were also obsessed, truly, deeply obsessed, with keeping their gods happy. The Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations here, around 3000 BCE, believed that humans had been created specifically to serve the gods. According to their myths, the gods grew tired of doing their own chores, digging canals, tending crops, feeding themselves, so they made humans to handle the menial labor. And just like any employer, they expected regular payments. Only, instead of money, the gods preferred offerings, food, incense, and yes, occasionally, blood. Most sacrifices here started small. Animals, especially sheep, goats, and bulls, were the usual payment method. But these weren't just random slaughters. The priests performed complex rituals, reciting hymns and prayers, and sometimes performing extispicy, the art of reading omens in the entrails of a sacrificed animal. Extispicy, from the Latin exta meaning entrails and spiciere meaning to observe, was basically ancient divine email. The gods didn't reply with words. They replied with liver spots and kidney shapes. But sometimes the gods demanded more than livestock. They wanted life itself. In certain Mesopotamian rituals, particularly those tied to war, plague, or royal succession, humans were offered as well. And these weren't always prisoners or criminals. Some were slaves, others were volunteers, usually hoping for divine favor in the afterlife. There are records from the city of Mari describing rituals in which the blood of the warrior was poured into the ground to sanctify a new palace or temple. Imagine that. You get promoted to captain, and next thing you know, your fertilizer for the god of storms. Nowhere was this blood as contract. Mentality stronger than in the Canaanite and Phoenician cultures, cousins of the Carthaginians. Their chief deity El and the storm god Baal weren't so different from their Mesopotamian neighbor's pantheon, moody, powerful, and easily offended. These societies practiced both animal and human sacrifice, often tied to oaths and covenants. The logic was simple, in a terrifying way. If you break a promise sealed in blood, the gods will break you. One chilling example comes from the Moabite king Mesha in the 9th century BCE. Facing defeat in battle, Mesha took his eldest son, the heir to the throne, and sacrificed him on the city wall as an offering to Chemosh, the national god of Moab. The result? According to historical accounts, the enemy army was so horrified that they retreated. Was it divine intervention or just sheer psychological warfare? Either way, the message was clear. Blood made bargains binding. And then there's the story of Abraham. Yes, that Abraham, from the Hebrew Bible, in the famous narrative, God commands him to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of faith. Spoiler alert, an angel intervenes at the last second, and a ram is offered instead. But the deeper point of the story isn't just about obedience. It reflects a world where child sacrifice was normal enough to be a believable request. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly condemns the practice of offering children to Moloch, a deity associated with fire, and sacrifice, precisely because so many neighboring cultures were doing it. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the mental gymnastics here. In modern society, a contract involves signatures, witnesses, and maybe a notary stamp. In the Bronze Age, it involved blood, bone, and the faint hope that your God wouldn't smite you into oblivion. And you thought signing a mortgage was stressful. But this wasn't just about fear. It was also about order. Blood sacrifice was a way to structure the universe. It was how people maintained balance between the mortal and the divine, the chaotic and the civilized. In a world where drought, disease, and death struck without warning, sacrifice offered a sense of control, a way to negotiate with forces beyond human understanding. In other words, it was humanity's earliest attempt at customer service, for the cosmostat, of course. As societies grew more complex and empires rose, some started questioning whether the gods truly needed so much blood. Rituals evolved, shifting towards symbolic offerings or animal substitutes. But the legacy of those ancient contracts lingered. Even in later religions, including Judaism and Christianity, the language of sacrifice remained central. Terms like covenant, atonement, and redemption all trace their roots back to these Bronze Age bargains signed in blood. And yet, the thirst of the gods was far from quenched. Across the seas, another empire was rising, one that would turn sacrifice into spectacle and ritual into political theater. The Romans were coming, and they would put blood on display like no civilization before them. But that, dear listener, is a story for another night. If blood was a contract in the ancient Near East, then Babylon was the notary public, the courthouse, and the high-end law firm all rolled into one, only with more incense and slightly higher chances of being disemboweled. By the time Babylon rose to power in the 18th century BCE, under kings like Hammurabi, yes, the eye for an eye guy, sacrifice had evolved from a desperate plea to the heavens into something far more sophisticated, a carefully choreographed ritual of religion, politics, and cosmic PR. Now, when we say Babylon, most people imagine golden statues, hanging gardens, and maybe a few orgies thrown in for good measure. And yes, there were all of those things. But beneath the glamour, Babylonian society revolved around one core principle: the gods must be appeased or civilization collapses. It's not an exaggeration. The Babylonians believed their city was literally a partnership between humans and the divine. Humans provided offerings and obedience. The gods provided order, protection, and preferably no floods. It was a fragile arrangement, and the ink, or rather, the blood, on that celestial contract needed constant renewal. The Babylonians, like their Sumerian predecessors, favored animal sacrifices for routine worship. Bulls, goats, sheep, basically anything that bleated, mooed, or had a pulse could be offered up. But unlike the raw, gory theatrics of Aztec rituals or the fiery horror shows of Carthage, Babylonian sacrifices were often ceremonial performances, deeply intertwined with state affairs. Take, for instance, the Akitu festival, Babylon's most important religious event, held every new year in honor of Marduk, the city's chief deity and the cosmic CEO of their pantheon. This wasn't just a temple party. It was a 12-day spiritual drama involving purification rites, recitations of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, parades of idols, and of course, sacrifices. But here's where things get truly wild. Part of the ceremony involved the king himself being ritually humiliated. The high priest would strip him of his royal insignia, slap him across the face, and make him swear that he had ruled justly. This ritual had a name: ritual abasement, a formalized public humiliation, designed to show that even kings were beneath the gods. And if the king's tears fell while he was slapped, yes, they watched for that. It was considered a good omen. No tears? The gods might be displeased. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world and getting your face smacked in front of a crowd, all for cosmic job security. But animal sacrifices and royal slaps weren't always enough. During times of crisis, war, famine, or ominous celestial events, the Babylonians sometimes resorted to far darker measures. One of the most fascinating and disturbing practices was the substitute king ritual, or Zarpiki, pronounced Sharpuhi. The logic went something like this. If the stars predicted doom for the king, the gods had already decided his fate. But what if we tricked them? In this elaborate deception, a condemned criminal or prisoner would be dressed as the king, seated on the throne, and treated as royalty for a few days. Then, once the predicted disaster date passed, he'd be executed, his blood symbolically fulfilling the omen, and the real king would return, alive and cleansed. It was the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of sending a decoy to a duel. The gods, apparently, were not very good at facial recognition. This intertwining of sacrifice and politics reveals something profound. By Babylonian times, blood wasn't just about religion, it was about power. Sacrifices legitimized kingship, sanctified wars, and even manipulated fate itself. The state and the temple weren't separate entities. They were one and the same. Priests were bureaucrats. Rituals were policy. And every drop of blood spilled on the altar was a message. To the gods, yes, but also to the people watching. Let's not forget the sheer spectacle of it all. Large state ceremonies could involve dozens, sometimes hundreds, of animals. These weren't chaotic bloodbaths. They were precision-engineered displays of order and devotion. The entrails of the animals were examined for signs, a practice known as hepatoscopy, from the Greek hepar, meaning liver. If the liver was smooth and unblemished, good news. If it was oddly shaped or discolored, bad omen. And if it was missing entirely, well, congratulations, you've just invented existential dread. And yet, amid the blood and entrails, there was also a deep intellectual sophistication. Babylonian priests were among the first to systematically record astronomical phenomena, correlate them with earthly events, and develop what we might call proto-science. Their sacrifices weren't just superstition. They were part of a broader worldview that sought to understand, predict, and negotiate with the forces that governed reality. But, of course, there's a darker side to this logic. Once you start believing that blood can alter fate, you inevitably start spilling more of it. And as Mesopotamian empires rose and fell, sacrifice remained central to every major decision, whether it was building a new temple, launching a war, or interpreting a solar eclipse. Every drop was a conversation with the divine, and sometimes a bribe. By the time the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires rolled around, roughly 900 to 500 BCE, the practice of sacrifice had become an indispensable tool of statecraft. Kings like Ashurbanipal and Nebuchadnezzar II didn't just conquer with armies, they conquered with rituals. Entire cities were consecrated with blood. Foreign gods were appeased with offerings before invasions. Even captured kings might find themselves sacrificed to seal a victory. It was religion weaponized, and the gods, whether they asked for it or not, were dragged into every imperial ambition. And so, sacrifice in the ancient Near East evolved from a simple plea for rain into a multi-layered system of control. Part theology, part politics, part cosmic negotiation. It wasn't about appeasing angry sky beings anymore. It was about using the gods as silent partners in humanity's most ambitious projects. But humanity wasn't done yet. If Babylon was the legal office of the divine, Rome would become its arena. And the Romans, they would take sacrifice to a level of theatrical spectacle so grand and so grotesque that even the gods might have needed a seat in the front row. And that is exactly where we're headed next. Pack your togas and sharpen your gladi, because the blood is about to hit the sand. If Babylon turned sacrifice into law, then Rome turned it into entertainment. The Romans didn't just offer blood to the gods. They built entire stadiums to watch it flow. And why not? If you're going to appease Jupiter, Mars, or some other divine landlord, you might as well sell tickets, serve wine, and make it a national holiday. Welcome to ancient Rome, where empire, religion, and bloodshed all shook hands, toasted each other, and strutted into the arena together. Let's get something straight. Right from the start, Rome was never squeamish about death. This was a civilization that thought nothing of crucifying thousands of slaves along the Appian Way just to make a point. These were people who built an empire stretching from Britain to Syria and called it Pax Romana, Roman peace, while simultaneously butchering half the known world. So it's hardly surprising that when it came to sacrifice, They decided to do it bigger, bloodier, and far more dramatically than anyone before them. But Rome's blood rituals didn't begin in the Colosseum. In fact, their earliest sacrifices looked much like those of their Etruscan and Greek neighbors. Small-scale, animal offerings to curry divine favor. Sheep, pigs, and oxen were the main stars of these ceremonies, often performed during festivals, military campaigns, or important political events. One of the most common rituals was the Suovad Aurelia, a triple sacrifice of a sus, pig, ovis, sheep, and taurus, bull, used to purify land, armies, or even entire cities. And here's a fun fact. The word sacrifice itself comes from the Latin sacrificium, meaning to make sacred. In theory, that's a noble concept. You give something valuable to the gods to sanctify your relationship with them. In practice, though, the Romans often interpreted something valuable as a lot of blood and maybe a screaming barbarian or two. Which brings us to the darker, more theatrical side of Roman religion, human sacrifice. Officially, Rome banned human sacrifice in 97 BCE, and like most government bans in history, this was mostly a public relations stunt. They wanted to appear more civilized than the barbaric Gauls or Carthaginians. But unofficially? Oh, they found loopholes big enough to march an entire legion through. Take, for example, the devotio. This was a military ritual in which a Roman general, faced with near certain defeat, would devote himself, body and soul, to the gods of the underworld, the Menes, by charging into enemy lines, ensuring his death and hopefully victory for Rome. This wasn't just heroic suicide. It was theology in action. By becoming a living sacrifice, the general was believed to purchase divine favor for his troops. Think of it as the ancient version of going out in a blaze of glory. Accept your death was a line item on the empire's religious budget. And then there were the more secretive rites, like those of the Argive festival. During this annual ceremony, straw effigies shaped like humans were thrown into the Tiber River, a symbolic replacement for an older practice in which actual humans were tossed in. Rome's priests assured everyone that the new, less bloody version was just as effective, but one suspects the gods might have been disappointed. After all, what's a good sacrifice without a little drowning? By the time the Roman Republic gave way to the empire, sacrifice had become deeply woven into the fabric of statecraft. Emperors used it to legitimize their rule, generals used it to sanctify their conquests, and ordinary citizens offered blood to ensure their crops grew or their children survived. But there was one arena, both literal and metaphorical, where sacrifice transcended religion and became something much bigger: spectacle. Enter the gladiatorial games. If you've ever wondered how a solemn ritual evolved into a blood-soaked public sport, the answer lies in an older practice called the munus, plural, munera. Originally, munera were private funerary offerings, deadly contests staged to honor the dead and provide them with souls to accompany them into the afterlife. Over time, however, these events grew larger and more elaborate, eventually moving from graveyards to arenas. And once the state realized how much the public loved watching men fight to the death, the rest was history. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, became the epicenter of this new sacrificial theater. Here, tens of thousands of Romans gathered to watch slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, and even volunteers. Yes, there were volunteers. Fight for glory, freedom, or at least a slightly less humiliating death. To the Romans, this wasn't mere entertainment. It was a ritual, an offering of blood and courage to the gods and the spirits of the dead. The games were often timed to coincide with religious festivals, imperial anniversaries, or military victories, transforming them into state-sponsored acts of devotion. Let's pause here to appreciate the absurdity. The Romans genuinely believed that by watching two Gauls hack each other to pieces with short swords, hence gladiators, they were participating in a sacred act. And in a way, they were. The games reinforced Roman values: bravery, discipline, obedience, and the inevitability of death. They reminded the public that life was fleeting, that fate was cruel, and that Rome, like the gods, demanded sacrifice. Of course, not all sacrifices involved combat. Some were much quieter, but no less chilling. During moments of crisis, plagues, invasions, natural disasters, Rome occasionally reverted to more archaic forms of offering. In 216 BCE, after a catastrophic defeat at Cannae during the Second Punic War, 2 pairs of Gauls and Greeks were buried alive beneath the Forum Boreum as a sacrifice to appease the gods. This practice, known as immuratio, Latin for walling in, was rare but revealing, even in the most rational empire of the ancient world. Blood was still seen as the ultimate insurance policy, but perhaps the most sinister evolution of Roman sacrifice was how it blurred the line between ritual and propaganda. Emperors, particularly those with delusions of divinity, Caligula, staged elaborate public sacrifices, not just to honor the gods, but to remind the people of their own godlike power. Sacrifices became pageantry, a political tool as much as a religious one. And the crowds, cheering as blood soaked the sand, were not just worshippers, they were witnesses to the empire's supremacy. In the end, Rome didn't sacrifice because it was barbaric. It sacrificed because it understood something fundamental about human nature. We are drawn to death, not just as a fear, but as a performance, a story, a ritual that helps us make sense of our place in the universe. The Romans gave death a stage, a script, and a cheering audience, and in doing so, they ensured that their gods were never hungry and their people never bored. But as the empire expanded and absorbed new cultures, sacrifice began to change once again. Blood still flowed, but now it mingled with philosophy, mystery cults, and foreign gods with strange appetites. Soon, the Romans would discover something even more powerful than blood, belief itself. And that, as you'll see in the next part, would change everything. By the height of its power, Rome had conquered most of the known world, and, in the process, had also conquered most of the known gods. The city that began by sacrificing pigs and sheep to a small pantheon of Latin deities ended up hosting hundreds of foreign gods from every corner of the empire. And with each new cult came new rituals, new myths, and of course, new ways to spill blood. If the early Romans were devout farmers praying for rain, the imperial Romans were spiritual magpies, stealing divine ideas from everywhere and turning them into a dazzling and occasionally horrifying religious circus. Rome was a sponge, but not the absorbent, gentle kind, more like a cosmic shoplifter. If your culture had a god that seemed powerful, useful, or fashionable, Rome would adopt it, and by adopt, I mean take it, Latinize its name, build a temple for it, and pretend it was Roman all along. That's how Isis, Egyptian, Mithras, Persian, Cybele, Anatolian, and even Sol Invictus Syrian ended up living comfortably on the Palatine Hill, probably wondering how they got there. But this was more than religious window dressing. These imported deities came with their own traditions, and many of those traditions involved blood. Let's start with one of the most dramatic. Cybele, also known as the Great Mother, Magna Mater. Brought to Rome from Phrygia, modern-day Turkey, during the Second Punic War, Cybele was a goddess of fertility, wild nature, and divine madness. And her cult? Let's just say it made the average Roman sacrifice look like a mild Sunday brunch. The priests of Cybele, known as Galli, didn't just serve the goddess. They devoted themselves body and soul, often quite literally. One of the most shocking rituals associated with Cybele was ritual castration. Yes, you heard that correctly. In a state of ecstatic frenzy, new initiates would sometimes emasculate themselves as a symbol of their total devotion to the goddess. Fun linguistic fact: the word gallus is related to the Latin term for a castrated rooster, which is both darkly fitting and deeply unfortunate. After their transformation, these priests would wear women's clothing, grow their hair long, and devote their lives to Cybele's service. And as if voluntary self-surgery wasn't traumatic enough, the cult also practiced taurobolium, a blood baptism involving a bull sacrifice. During the ritual, a bull was slaughtered on a wooden platform with holes in it, while the initiates stood beneath, arms outstretched, letting the animal's warm blood rain down on them. It was a purification ceremony, a rebirth, and probably the reason ancient Roman laundromats charged extra for bloodstains. Cybele wasn't the only foreign god to bring new flavors of sacrifice to Rome. Enter Mithras, the Persian god of light, truth, and cosmic order, and weirdly enough, one of the most popular deities among Roman soldiers. Mithraic worship revolved around a ritual known as the tauroctony, from Greek tauros equals bull, tainu equals to kill, a symbolic depiction of Mithras slaying a cosmic bull. Although there's no definitive evidence that actual bull sacrifices were performed in every Mithraic temple, the imagery was so central to the cult that many scholars believe blood rituals were a significant part of initiation ceremonies. The Mithraic cult was secretive, mysterious, and male only. Think of it as the Freemasons, but with more blood and fewer business cards. Ritual meals, odes of brotherhood, and staged reenactments of cosmic battles were all part of the experience. And because the cult promised salvation and eternal life to its followers, it became a powerful competitor to another rising faith that would eventually change Rome forever: Christianity. But we'll get to that particular theological cage match in a later chapter. Then there was Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic and motherhood. Her worship in Rome was less about gore and more about elaborate ceremonies, sacred water, and incense, but even she wasn't free from the occasional bloodletting. Animal sacrifices were common during her festivals, and in some accounts, devotees even offered drops of their own blood as personal offerings. You know, just a little de-age spirituality, very on trend in the ancient Mediterranean. But perhaps the most politically charged import was Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. His cult exploded in popularity during the 3rd century CE, particularly under Emperor Aurelian, who elevated Sol to the status of a state god. Festivals in his honor featured lavish sacrifices, both animal and human, and were timed to coincide with the winter solstice. Sound familiar? That's because elements of Sol's worship, including his birthday celebration on December 25th, were later rebranded under a new management team and became a little holiday we now call Christmas. What's remarkable, and slightly hilarious, about all this is how pragmatic the Romans were about religion. They weren't interested in theological purity or doctrinal consistency. Their logic was basically, if it works, we'll sacrifice to it. If they thought a Syrian sun god could protect their crops, they'd build him a temple. If they believed a Phrygian mother goddess could bless their armies, they'd let priests mutilate themselves in her honor. This flexibility wasn't a flaw. It was a survival strategy. It kept the gods happy, the empire stable, and the people mostly compliant. But this openness also had unintended consequences. As cult after cult flooded into the empire, the Roman religious landscape became a chaotic buffet of competing ideas, rituals, and promises. Some preached salvation, others offered cosmic order, and a few promised immortality, all for the low price of a little blood. The result was a spiritual arms race, and the old gods of Jupiter and Mars started to look, well, a bit outdated. This shift marked a crucial turning point. Sacrifice was no longer just a ritual obligation. It was a spiritual currency. People weren't just offering blood for rain or victory anymore. They were offering it for eternal life, divine union, and mystical transcendence. The act of sacrifice had gone from feeding the gods to transforming the soul. And then, just when Rome thought it had seen it all, the blood baptisms, the cosmic bull slayings, the sun worship, the ecstatic castrations, a small, stubborn sect from Judea appeared and flipped the whole script. They preached a religion that claimed one final, perfect sacrifice had already been made, not in a temple, not in an arena, but on a wooden cross. The story of that sacrifice and how it would topple empires is where our journey turns next. But before we leave the blood-soaked temples of Rome behind, let's pause to marvel at humanity's creativity. We started with sheep and ended with sacred self-mutilation, global sun cults, and competitive cosmic bullfighting. If nothing else, the gods can never accuse us of being boring. If you thought the story of sacrifice ended neatly with Jesus on the cross, and humanity collectively deciding, "Welp, no more blood from now on," then oh, dear reader, you must be new here. Humanity never gives up a good ritual. We just change the props, rewrite the script, and tell ourselves it's different this time. The truth is, even after Christianity declared that one perfect sacrifice had ended the need for all others, the thirst for blood, literal or metaphorical, stubbornly refused to go quietly into the theological night. In fact, the post-crucifixion world might be the most ironic chapter in the whole bloody saga. Because while Christians were busy preaching forgiveness, humility, and turning the other cheek, they were also quite enthusiastically finding new ways to shed blood for God. The knife had changed hands, but it was still very much in use. Let's start with the most obvious example, martyrdom. In early Christianity, martyrdom, from the Greek martys, meaning witness, was seen as the highest form of devotion, a kind of spiritual encore to Christ's sacrifice. To die for your faith wasn't just noble. It was participation in the divine drama. The blood of the martyrs, as the early theologian Tertullian famously put it, was the seed of the church. And boy, did the church grow fast on that fertilizer. The Roman Empire, ever the drama queen, provided plenty of opportunities. Christians were thrown to lions, burned alive, crucified, and occasionally turned into human torches for Nero's garden parties. Yes, really, the emperor had a flair for mood lighting. Far from discouraging converts, these spectacles only fueled the movement. Watching an unarmed believer sing hymns while being eaten by a leopard had a way of making pagan gods look, well, a little petty. But as Christianity transitioned from persecuted cult to imperial powerhouse, the meaning of sacrifice morphed again. Once Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, and later emperors adopted it as the state religion, there was no need for believers to die for their faith. Now they could kill in the name of their faith, which, apparently, was an entirely different thing. Enter the Crusades, those charming medieval road trips where knights with crosses on their shields marched off to the Holy Land to liberate Jerusalem and slaughter anyone in their way. From 1096 onward, popes promised crusaders that their bloodshed would not only please God, but also wipe away their sins. Killing infidels became a shortcut to paradise, a kind of buy one, get one free deal for the soul. Historians call this theology indulgentia plenaria, full remission of sins in exchange for taking up the cross. Medieval marketing at its finest, but the Crusades weren't just about external enemies. Oh no, the Christian world was perfectly happy to spill blood at home too. Cue the Inquisition, a multi-century campaign to root out heresy, blasphemy, and anyone who disagreed with official church doctrine. From the Albigensian Crusade, which massacred tens of thousands of Catholic Christians in southern France, to the Spanish Inquisition, famous for torture chambers and enthusiastic bonfires, sacrifice once again became institutionalized. This time, It wasn't lambs or bulls. It was people whose beliefs were considered impure. The rationale was chillingly familiar. Better to destroy the body and save the soul. But even when people weren't being burned alive or hacked to pieces, the obsession with blood persisted in subtler and weirder ways. Consider the medieval fascination with relics, physical remains or possessions of saints believed to possess miraculous power. A single drop of blood from a martyr could heal the sick. A splinter from the true cross could grant victory in battle. By the 13th century, entire churches were built around tiny vials of blood supposedly belonging to Christ or the saints. Fun fact, there were so many claimed relics of the true cross floating around medieval Europe that if you assembled them all, you could probably build a small house, maybe even a summer home. Then there's the Eucharist, the central ritual of Christian worship, where bread and wine represent and, in Catholic belief, become the body and blood of Christ. The doctrine behind this transformation is called transubstantiation, a fancy word that basically means it still tastes like bread and wine. But trust us, it's Jesus now. While it's a bloodless ritual physically, the symbolism is unmistakable. The faithful are spiritually nourished by consuming a sacrifice. And unlike the ancient temples where blood offerings had to be repeated endlessly, this one sacrifice, remembered and reenacted at every Mass, was considered eternal and complete. The irony here is delicious. Pun absolutely intended. Christianity had declared the end of blood sacrifices, yet the central act of its worship revolved around the symbolic consumption of divine blood. And believers, far from finding this creepy, embraced it as the ultimate expression of divine love. As one medieval theologian put it, the altar is the cross, and the victim is the lamb who was slain. In other words, new wrapping. Same story. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of penance, acts of self-inflicted suffering meant to atone for sin. Some devout Christians whipped themselves with scourges, flagellation, to imitate Christ's suffering. Others walked barefoot on pilgrimages that lasted for months or even years. The logic was ancient and familiar. Suffering equals purification. In a way, this was just another form of sacrifice. But now the altar was your own body. And then, of course, there were the wars of religion. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses, tore Christendom apart. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other by the tens of thousands, each side convinced that they were defending the true faith. Cities were sacked, heretics burned, and holy wars waged, all under banners bearing the cross. The blood of believers once again flowed, proving that even when theology changes, human behavior often does not dot by the time Europe stumbled into the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Many philosophers had begun to question the whole bloody enterprise. Thinkers like Voltaire and John Locke mocked the idea that divine favor required violence. And yet, even as science rose and religion's grip weakened, the language of sacrifice refused to disappear. Revolutionaries spoke of sacrificing for liberty. Nations demanded blood and honor from their citizens. Soldiers were called upon to give their lives for God and country. The altar had simply moved from the temple to the battlefield, from the church to the nation-state. And that's the great, uncomfortable truth of human history. We never really stopped sacrificing. We just found new gods, ideology, empire, freedom, and kept offering them blood. Christianity might have transformed the concept, refined it, even spiritualized it, but the underlying impulse remained stubbornly intact. The old instincts, to give, to suffer, to bleed for something greater, proved stronger than any theological decree. It's almost poetic, isn't it? We began with terrified farmers slaughtering goats to make it rain. We ended with kings, popes, and presidents sending millions to die for invisible ideals. The costumes changed. The rituals evolved. But the heartbeat of sacrifice, that primal, desperate desire to trade blood for meaning, never missed a beat. And yet, as we step closer to the modern age, sacrifice is about to face its most dramatic transformation yet. In a world driven by reason and technology, can the ancient logic of blood still survive? Or has it simply taken on a form so subtle we barely recognize it anymore? The answer, as always, is darker and far more familiar than you might think. By the time the Roman Empire reached its imperial peak, the art of sacrifice had gone through more rebrands than a Silicon Valley startup. It had started as a desperate plea to the heavens. Please don't kill our crops. Evolved into political theater. Please bless our emperor. And eventually became a cosmic blood economy, complete with exotic gods, ecstatic cults, and an arena subscription model that made the Colosseum the Netflix of death. But just as the Romans were congratulating themselves on having perfected the business of pleasing the divine, something unexpected happened. A new religion walked onto the stage and flipped the script entirely. It didn't demand endless offerings. It didn't require rivers of blood. And it didn't even ask for a bull or a goat. It claimed that one sacrifice, a single voluntary death, was not only enough but final. And it changed the world forever. We're talking, of course, about Christianity, a movement so small and so insignificant at its birth that no Roman historian even bothered to write about it for nearly a century. And yet, by the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, this obscure faith from a dusty corner of Judea had transformed the very meaning of sacrifice. Let's rewind to the beginning. Back to 1st century Judea, a region the Romans had conquered but never truly controlled. It was a cultural melting pot, simmering with Jewish religious fervor, Greek philosophy, and Roman imperial propaganda. Among the many Jewish sects active at the time, one in particular preached something radically different. Their leader, a Galilean teacher named Yeshua, whom the Greek-speaking world would later call Jesus, spoke of a kingdom not of this world, forgiveness over vengeance, and a God who desired mercy, not burnt offerings. Now, to understand just how revolutionary this was, we need to appreciate what sacrifice meant in Judaism at the time. The temple in Jerusalem, specifically the Second Temple, rebuilt in the 6th century BCE, was the beating heart of Jewish religious life. It was here that priests performed elaborate sacrificial rituals on behalf of the people. Daily offerings of lambs and grain were made to Yahweh, the God of Israel, while special festivals like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, involved blood sacrifices to cleanse the sins of the entire nation. The underlying principle was the same one we've seen again and again. Sin creates a debt, and blood pays the bill. But Jesus offered a radically new perspective. He criticized the religious establishment for obsessing over ritual while ignoring justice, compassion, and humility. In one of his most quoted lines, he says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Hosea 6:6, which he loved to quote, yes. Even ancient teachers liked citing their sources. His message was clear. God didn't want more dead animals. He wanted transformed hearts. And then came the event that would redefine sacrifice for millennia, the crucifixion. Crucifixion, crux in Latin, meaning cross, was Rome's favorite way of making a point, a brutal, humiliating punishment reserved for slaves, rebels, and the lowest criminals. Victims were nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to die slowly, often over several days. It was not just execution. It was theater, designed to terrify anyone who might think about challenging Roman power. According to Christian belief, Jesus willingly submitted to this horror. His death was not an accident or a political misstep. It was a sacrifice, offered not to appease an angry sky god, but to reconcile humanity with the divine. In theological terms, this idea is known as substitutionary atonement, the belief that Jesus took upon himself the punishment deserved by humanity, offering his life as a substitute. Think of it as the ultimate, "I'll take the blame for this moment," except it involves cosmic justice and eternity. This was a revolutionary shift in religious thinking. For thousands of years, humans had offered blood to the gods in the hope of forgiveness. Christianity flipped the logic. God offered his own blood to forgive humans. No temple, no altar, no annual festivals of slaughter, just one sacrifice, once and for all. As the Epistle to the Hebrews put it, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. But Christ offered for all time a single sacrifice. Of course, this wasn't an easy sell in the Roman world. To many pagans, the idea of worshiping a crucified man was absurd. Gods were supposed to hurl thunderbolts, win battles, and demand tribute, not die shamefully on a piece of wood. The philosopher Celsus, one of Christianity's earliest critics, mocked the faith for worshiping what he called a dead criminal. The Romans themselves found the concept unsettling. The word crux was considered so vulgar and offensive that polite society avoided using it, the ancient equivalent of a swear word. And yet, against all odds, the message spread. At first, Christianity was a small, persecuted sect, driven underground and periodically hunted by imperial authorities. But it thrived among the poor, the enslaved, and the powerless, those for whom the idea of a suffering, self-sacrificing God held immense appeal. By the 3rd century, it had gained enough followers to attract serious attention. And by the 4th century, Emperor Constantine himself converted, issuing the Edict of Milan, 313 CE, which legalized Christianity throughout the empire. Suddenly, the faith of the crucified was no longer a fringe cult, it was the religion of emperors. And with that, the old sacrificial systems began to crumble. Temples that had once reeked of blood and smoke were abandoned or converted into churches. The Colosseum, once a monument to state-sponsored slaughter, fell silent. Even the language of sacrifice changed. Words like hostia, victim, and sacrificium, sacrifice, were now used metaphorically to describe acts of devotion, charity, or even martyrdom. But, and here's the truly ironic part, the idea of sacrifice didn't disappear. It just transformed. Instead of animals or prisoners, the new faith asked for something far more challenging: yourself. Christianity introduced the concept of the living sacrifice. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've walked through more blood than a medieval surgeon with a drinking problem. We've seen hearts ripped out atop Aztec temples, children tossed into Carthaginian flames, kings replaced by doomed stand-ins in Babylon, gladiators bleeding for the entertainment of Roman crowds, and armies marching to holy slaughter in the name of a god who supposedly didn't need blood anymore. It's been quite a ride. But here's the punchline to this gruesome historical joke. We never stopped. Modern humanity, with all its smartphones, satellites, and smug self-confidence, loves to believe it's evolved beyond the primitive rituals of the past. We scoff at the Aztecs and shake our heads at the Carthaginians, muttering, "How barbaric." We pat ourselves on the back for trading altars, for laboratories, temples for parliaments, and priests for scientists. But strip away the fancy vocabulary and stainless steel tools, and you'll see that the altar is still there. It's just bigger now. And instead of a bull or a prisoner, we place ourselves on it. Let's start with the most obvious example: war. Wars are, in many ways, the modern continuation of ancient sacrificial logic, just dressed up in national flags and patriotic speeches. The language gives it away. We talk about sacrificing lives for freedom, spilling blood for the homeland, and dying for the greater good. These phrases sound noble, but they are simply updated versions of old ideas. The gods of the past demanded blood for victory. Today, nations do. And while we no longer build ziggurats or altars, we do build monuments and memorials, where we honor the fallen with offerings of flowers and silence. Consider World War. A conflict so catastrophic that entire generations were wiped out for the sake of imperial pride and vague promises of peace. Over 16 million dead, many of them barely old enough to shave, thrown into trenches and sacrificed to the gods of nationalism and industrialized violence. And yet, they were told and believed that their deaths were necessary, that the future of civilization depended on their blood. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same logic that drove the priest to cut the heart from a captive atop a temple. Suffering now, salvation later, even outside the battlefield. Sacrifice remains embedded in our collective psyche, though it's often less bloody and more bureaucratic. We sacrifice our time, health, and relationships for success. We give our lives to corporations, causes, or ideologies. The altar may now be a cubicle or a political rally instead of a stone slab. But the principle hasn't changed. Offer something precious. And maybe, just maybe, the powers that be, fate, society, the market will reward you. And then there's the dark side of progress itself. The blood we spill not as offerings, but as collateral damage. Industrialization brought prosperity, yes, but it also brought factories where children died in machinery and workers collapsed in mines. The pursuit of scientific knowledge gave us medicine, but it also gave us medical experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, from the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States to the horrors of Nazi doctors in concentration camps. These are sacrifices too, not deliberate perhaps, but sacrifices nonetheless, made on the altar of progress. Even our politics can't escape the pull of ancient patterns. Totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, fascism, communism, imperialism, demanded human lives not just as soldiers, but as symbols. Purges, gulags, death camps, all justified in the name of utopia, purity, or revolution. Millions were sacrificed to abstract ideas, their suffering rationalized as the necessary blood price for a better future. Replace the word state with God, and the rhetoric becomes indistinguishable from that of an ancient priest, justifying a ritual killing. But perhaps the most revealing and unsettling example of modern sacrifice is one we rarely think about: the cult of consumerism. This might sound ridiculous, but bear with me. In the ancient world, people offered blood to secure the favor of unseen powers. Today, we offer our time, attention, money, and even privacy to corporations and algorithms, equally invisible forces that promise to fulfill our desires. We sacrifice authenticity for likes, privacy for convenience, mental health for productivity. And in return, the modern gods, Amazon, Meta, Google, shower us with blessings in the form of next-day delivery, dopamine hits, and targeted ads. No knives, no altars, but the dynamic is hauntingly familiar. Now, let's not get too self-righteous here. Sacrifice isn't inherently evil. It's arguably one of the most human things we do. To sacrifice is to believe that something, an ideal, a person, a future, is worth more than ourselves. It's what drives parents to work 3 jobs for their children, what inspires doctors to risk their lives during pandemics, what moves activists to face imprisonment, or worse, in the name of justice. Sacrifice, in its best form, is an act of love, a recognition that our existence has meaning. When it's given to something beyond us, the problem isn't that we sacrifice. The problem is that we often don't question what we're sacrificing for. In the ancient world, people rarely stopped to ask whether their gods truly needed blood. They just assumed it. Today, we rarely question whether the causes that demand our time, money, and lives are truly worthy. Are we sacrificing to nourish the world, or to feed a machine that will never be satisfied? And that's the dark irony that ties our story together. We began this journey in the flickering torchlight of a Neolithic temple, watching a trembling priest offer blood to an unseen power. And here we are, thousands of years later, still kneeling, not before stone idols, but before ideologies, economies, and digital deities. We still believe that suffering buys us salvation. We still trust that death can give life meaning. We still think that blood, literal or metaphorical, is the price of progress. Perhaps that's because sacrifice, at its core, is not about gods at all. It's about us. It's a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting our deepest fears and highest hopes. It's our way of saying, we are willing to pay any price to matter. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us human. Not the blood we spill, but the belief that something is worth bleeding. For Dot, so the next time you read about a war fought for freedom, or a protester dying for justice, or even just someone sacrificing their dreams for their family, remember this: you are witnessing the latest chapter in an ancient story. The gods have changed their names, the temples have changed their shapes, but the altar still stands, waiting, as it always has, for the next offering. And with that, dear listener, our tale draws to a close. We have traveled from sacred fires and obsidian knives to crucifixes and corporate boardrooms, from temples soaked in human blood to screens soaked in human attention. The world around us might look different from the one our ancestors knew, but the heartbeat beneath it, steady, relentless, and hungry, remains the same. Dot, because in the end, the gods never demanded blood. We did.